Hello. Today is December 27th, 2017. My name is Will Greer, and I am interviewing for the Women's March Oral History Project. How are you today?
I'm doing fine.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you taking the time for this. So, why don't we just start with some biographical information. What year were you born?
1965.
Okay. And where were you born?
Actually, not far from here. I'm a native. I was born in DeKalb General.
Oh, really?
So I grew up kind of all around Atlanta and DeKalb County.
Oh, wow. So what different parts of Atlanta did you grow up in?
I was born in, I grew up as a child in South DeKalb County, right off Wesley Chapel Road. And then in the late 80s, when I was married, my wife and I moved back into town, into Grant Park. My parents grew up in Grant Park. So my grandparents moved in town right near Grant Park in the 1920s. So my parents grew up there. So when I decided to buy a house, I bought a house near the neighborhood where my parents grew up in Ormwood Park.
Oh, very nice.
So I lived there for a long time, and then I moved to Midtown in 2009.
Okay, so you've lived in this area of town for about 8 years now, or?
Yes, yeah, in Midtown.
Terrific. So what is your profession?
During the day, I'm a project manager at a library network. So I work on a project that's funded through a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and we provide training in emergency preparedness for performing arts organizations. So I've worked at this library network for about 25 years. And this is a new project for us. We're just taking the expertise that we have with emergency preparedness and disaster planning that we've cultivated with cultural heritage organizations, and we're adapting it for performing arts organizations.
Oh, terrific. How did you end up working for the library?
When I was a graduate student in sociology at Georgia State, I worked in Poland Library. So that would have been in the around 1990. And I worked on a preservation project that was funded by a grant through the National Endowment for the Humanities. So we were working on preserving the Georgiana collection at Poland Library at Georgia State. And then I just eventually moved to the main office that was organizing that project, and I became the project manager for that project, that preservation project funded by the NEH.
Oh, terrific. So when you said by day, this is what you do, that implies there's something else that you do?
I also do some photojournalism work,
okay,
which ties into the Women's March. So I had worked on some photo preservation projects for a few years at this library network that got me very interested in photography, and specifically in documenting social movements. So I was working with historically Black colleges that had these rich collections of photographs and negatives that documented the period from Reconstruction through the Harlem Renaissance, through the Civil Rights Movement. And I realized that things were still happening just outside my front door. I could just walk downtown and see things that were happening that were sometimes the beginnings of social movements, sometimes continuation of things. So in 2014, there was a coalition of progressive left organizations that came together and called themselves the Moral Monday Movement. And it was a coalition of labor groups, teachers' unions, feminist organizations, some other faith-based organizations. And they came together to support one another's causes in the legislature. So the coalition would meet every Monday during the sessions at the Capitol in 2014 and have protests around specific issues. And one of the major things was Medicaid expansion. So they were trying to pressure the governor into accepting Medicaid expansion for Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
So I started going down and photographing these protests that were dealing with issues that I cared about, such as teacher salaries, Medicaid expansion, LGBT rights, things like that. And I just started going down and photographing it and documenting it and working with a wire service. So some of my pictures would be picked up by The Guardian, The Economist, some other news organizations. And so I've just continued doing that. So I do photograph. My preference right now is to photograph social movements. So it would be political rallies, marches, speeches, any type of organizing. But I also photograph parades and celebrations and musicians around Atlanta.
Very cool. Very cool. Any major musicians like whom? Just out of curiosity.
I like jazz. So most of the people I photograph are local people who are not on the national stage yet, but I like punk rock as well. Like I've been photographing friends in a band called the Blood Plums.
Oh, cool.
Around town, it's great to go into small venues and, sometimes underground places and document the scene, but the jazz scene here is great. We have some phenomenal jazz players. Gordon Vernick is the head of the Georgia State University Jazz Studies program.
Mm-hmm.
So he hosts a jam around town and sometimes invites me to the Rialto at Georgia State to photograph things that are happening with the jazz orchestra there.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, what political party would you say that you support?
Not really into partisan politics.
Okay.
I would say I'm progressive. I did vote for Hillary Clinton during the election. During the primaries, I was a supporter of Bernie Sanders. So I tend to go more left, socialist, progressive. But given the situation in the past election, I did vote for Hillary, out of concern for what would happen.
Right. Well, so you document social movements and you document political activism. Have you done any sort of activism yourself in the past?
I guess it depends on how you define activism. I've worked with homeless people, taking food, volunteering at the food bank, sending postcards, things like that. Since as a photographer, for the things that, we'll say for the rallies and protests that I attend, I ethically can't be a part of the organizing of an event if I'm going to report on it.
Right.
So I support the events and I try and document them as objectively as I can. However, once I'm finished with submitting my photos to the wire service or to whatever publication I might be shooting for, I retain the rights to my images. So I give them to the organizing groups that, such as the organizing group that put together the Women's March. I just made all of my photos available to them as well for them to use. So that's a form of my activism. I believe I am helping to amplify the voice of the organizers who are dealing with issues that I care about.
So do you consider yourself a participant or an observer, or how would you define?
Activist photographer.
Okay.
I'm an observer, but I would not say participant observer.
Okay.
I would not carry a sign nor chant,
Okay.
nor contribute to an action as it is happening.
I see. But is there
Because then there would be ethical issues that
right?
I've helped put something together, and then I'm going to photograph it and try and submit it seemingly objectively when I would have had a hand in
So
creating something.
do you feel that like, are there specific things you would amplify versus things you wouldn't? Or, I mean, is the choice of what you amplify a role, part of your role, or is that?
Do you mean could you elaborate?
Well, sure. Like, I mean, would you document a Tea Party rally the same way, or would you?
I would document it and submit it to the wire service. However, I would not give them my pictures.
Okay. So you will
I would make them available to news outlets.
Okay.
However, I do not want to support them personally, so I would not give them these images. However, I have seen some far right-wing groups taking pictures from Klan and Confederate flag rallies, who've taken some of my images to use for their own and made right-wing memes out of them and used them on far-right websites in Germany.
That's
without my permission.
That is disconcerting on multiple levels.
Yes, yeah.
What do you do about that? I mean,
I keep a record of it. I have not gone after them with cease and desist unless it seems to be a perpetual thing with a specific group, but so far that has not been an issue.
Okay. Well, let's get into the brass tacks then. And so why did you attend the march on January 21st?
I had been hearing about the organizing of the march shortly after the election of Donald Trump. We had heard first about the rallies that were being organized in Washington, and then satellite rallies were being organized in states around the country, and I knew that Atlanta would be represented, so I kind of followed the development of the march because I felt that I knew the people there would be addressing significant issues, a variety of significant issues. And before that march that happened on January 21st of this year, right after the election happened, a lot of marches started happening spontaneously. I think even the day after the election, there was a march, and there were several that were just happening very quickly. People were able to organize these gatherings within a few hours and have a few hundred people show up at Piedmont Park or Woodruff Park because they were so upset and concerned about what was going to happen with the direction that the country was going to take after Trump's election. So those rallies were just intensely passionate, and people were frightened, angry, shocked, confused. So the momentum for those marches kept up for a few months and kind of built up to January. And at this point, do you want me to start just talking about the rally?
Sure. So you attended the march in Atlanta.
Right.
And so as you were, feel free to just start talking about, I mean, I'll have some questions for you. Of course, your role was a little different than most people have normally interviewed, so I actually might have to go a little off book question-wise. So, but before, was there a specific issue that was really important to you, that you wanted to see represented, or that you felt needed to be amplified, or that you felt?
It's hard to say a specific issue. It's concerned with the rise of a kind of neo-fascism in the country, and
Okay.
I realized, I was laughing all last year when I was thinking, we can really talk about fascism in a real way without it being hyperbole. In the past, it used to be a name you would just call someone.
Right.
But I see it's not really hyperbole now. It's really, things are going in that direction when we actually have, last year, I was at a Nazi rally, and there were people flying swastikas and marching around, goose-stepping and doing Heil Hitlers openly. And I've been to a couple of several Confederate flag rallies, and a couple of them had a lot of Klan members there who were very open about who they were. And they seemed much bolder since Trump became popular, and then after his election, they seemed much bolder. So I guess this kind of a general neo-fascism is something I'm very concerned about, but that would address a host of many issues.
Right, I see. Yeah, definitely would. But I see what you're saying. Well, what were you expecting? I mean, you have a lot of experience attending rallies and marches as an observer. So what were you expecting to see?
I did not know exactly what was going to happen, because after the election, new people started showing up at protests and at public meetings. In the past, like during the Black Lives Matter movement, when that was picking up in 2014, 2015, at marches and organizing meetings, you would see a lot of the same faces, be the same organizing groups, same leaders, and the same people showing up to do work. But after the election, a lot of new people started showing up. So it's often in the kind of progressive activist community. It's like a gathering of friends almost. You show up and everybody knows one another, so you say hello to everybody there, and everybody knows what to do. But then it was different after the election. New people were showing up saying, "This is the first time I've ever been politically motivated." So that's something that was going on, and I'm forgetting the question you asked me that prompted me to go on that
But
direction.
what you expected to see?
I expected to see a lot of new people. I didn't know how big it was going to be. Since there were new organizations, I didn't think they could pull off something that huge. Then I heard, and a couple of days before it started, John Lewis was going to speak, which drew a bit more attention to it. I did expect to see a lot of the same organizations represented there. I expected to see labor, feminist groups, LGBTQ groups represented, because I mean all of their issues were being pressed by the election. I mean he really touched so many issues. So I expected to see a broad coalition of organizations coming together to express this huge response with expressing anger and fear, the need to be organized. A lot of people were just shocked, stunned that this happened, that we were in this situation.
Definitely. So, how about the group did you travel with? Were you in a group, or were you just traveled alone?
It's on my own.
Okay. I guess that would work best as.
Yeah, I usually for marches. So I live here in Midtown. I usually for marches I catch a lift to wherever a rally starts. So I go, and my practice is to show up half an hour or so early, wander around, do a lot of establishing shots, kind of show people as they're gathering, get some initial shots, people with signs, and then if there's going to be speakers, I usually position myself right in front of speakers and document that. And if people start to organize for the march, I usually run and get in front of the march and shoot in front of the march for a while, and then I kind of run alongside the march, run through it, shoot the end of it. So I'm usually running from beginning to end and kind of worming my way through a crowd and trying to document what is happening in the middle of the crowd and capture a lot of the environment around to kind of establish a sense of space, get street signs, significant buildings, any landmarks to kind of show this is where this is happening at this time.
So where was the first place you went for that day?
For this march.
For this march, yeah.
It was started at the Center for Civil and Human Rights.
Okay.
So,
what time did you show up there?
do you want me to just start talking in general about that day?
Absolutely.
Okay. So for that day, I was monitoring it through Facebook primarily, just to kind of get an idea of the numbers. And I can't remember what the numbers were. I had RSVP'd on Facebook for that event page. But it started raining that morning, and it was storming. It was torrential downpours. I believe it had started the day before. So I was expecting not many people to show up at all. And it was cold. It's January and it's pouring down rain, and it's in the middle of the city, and a lot of people who don't live in the city don't like to come into the city when traffic is unusual or if the weather's bad. So I was expecting maybe 3,000 to 5,000 people to show up, since it looked so miserable outside. And I just kept expecting they're going to call it, they're going to postpone it till the following weekend if they can. So I went down anyway. I carried 2 cameras and a camera bag, so it's kind of difficult to jostle around in crowds for me, but I came prepared to shoot in the rain. So I showed up about half an hour before it was scheduled to start. It may have been scheduled around 1 or noon. I'm forgetting the exact time. But I took a lift, and when I got there were, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30,000 people already there, gathered around the center. So I was shocked, and it was drizzling at the time. It was just miserable. So I've got a poncho and a rain setup that I use when I shoot during storms. So I put on all my rain gear, and I pushed my way through this really dense crowd, wet, muddy crowd, until I could see where there was a stage set up right at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. There's a large kind of a fountain area, and this was between the fountain and the front of the building. So I just pushed my way around, and I saw a platform for media that was in front of what looked like a stage where there were microphones where people were going to speak. So I just kind of squeezed my way through and climbed up on this little platform, got my gear out, and then eventually, the speakers started coming out and talking. And from where the stage was, you couldn't see what was happening behind us. We couldn't tell how big the crowd was getting. People were still arriving until well into the speakers. And it may have been when John Lewis came on stage that the crowd cheered. The whole crowd cheered. And it was at that point that we could hear waves of cheering and clapping going off in the distance. So everyone who was up on the platform and up at the stage who couldn't see the crowd just kind of got very quiet and listened and just kind of looked around at one another in amazement, because we realized the crowd was much larger than we had anticipated. And the crowd size was estimated, I believe, at 60,000. So that was a remarkable thing, and it kind of changed the energy that I felt around the stage down there, because we realized that this is something very significant that's happening for all of these people to have come out in the rain like this. So John Lewis spoke, and several other speakers, and Arrested Development played.
Who were some of the other speakers?
I can't remember off the top of my head right now. I can't remember if Senator Ford spoke or Francis Johnson spoke at the beginning. There were speakers at the beginning and the end.
Okay.
And some of the organizers of the day came up and introduced themselves.
Were there any speeches that really stood out to you?
No, in my role there, I'm looking for visuals.
Okay.
So my experience of it is very different. I'm just getting paragraphs here and there that I may record or write down that I think might be significant for a write-up. But I'm so in the moment with that, trying to capture visuals, that I have to look at my notes to actually know who spoke.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. But so how would you describe in a little more, could you describe a little more detail, sort of the atmosphere of the crowd that you saw, or
it was a mix of shock and anger and elation. I'm thinking a lot of people have never participated in a large collective action before. So coming there and being in the middle of a crowd who were experiencing the same emotions, I think gave people an outlet for their anger, as well as feeling that they weren't alone, that there was something common going on. So there were a lot of people who were just obviously very happy to be there and were elated. And a lot of people seemed more hopeful. It appeared more hopeful to me, having been there. I'm looking at some of the pictures that I took as we talk, and I'm just seeing some of the signs. I believe Carrie Fisher had, I think she maybe had passed by then. So there was a lot of Star Wars signs with Carrie Fisher on them, saying a woman's place is in the resistance.
What were some of the other signs that really stood out to you that you really liked?
A common one was Pussy Grabs Back.
Okay.
Reflecting on the recording we have of Donald Trump talking about grabbing pussies. So there's also the nasty woman meme that's going around that's quoting Trump again. And here is someone we both know, Susan, who I believe you may have interviewed as well. She was, her signs were around the wall.
Fewer walls, more bridges. Yeah, she actually talked about that in her interview.
Yeah. So there was a lot of signs that dealt with that, but she also had, I believe, on the reverse of those signs, we're dealing with healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
So she, oh yeah, here she has
Yeah.
another sign, uninsurable.
Right.
Since the Republicans and Trump were threatening Obamacare. So a lot of people, one of the things they were afraid of was losing their health care. But the Russian meddling in the elections
yes.
issue was also a common theme on the signs. Lots of signs. And I love this one. Someone had this at a couple of rallies that had a photo cut out of Donald Trump with devil horns. And below it, it says, "Make America Hate Again."
Wow.
So there were a lot of signs like that, and some clever people blended things, and somebody says on the sign, "Grab him by the Putin."
Mm-hmm.
There's Veterans Against Trump, gun safety for all. One sign has many things: gun safety, equality, housing, and affordable health care for all.
Okay.
On there. So it was really interesting to see the all of the different issues that people wanted to address.
Keep your filthy paws off my silky drawers. That's another sign that you're showing right here.
Yeah, and these are some friends of mine who are ministers. Peace, love, tolerance. Let's see, and there's Arrested Development up there. They're a local Atlanta hip hop group. But they were gathered on this tiny, overcrowded stage for this rally. There's another sign: "When she walks, the revolution is coming." Oh, it's a quote from Bikini Kill.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the band Bikini Kill.
Healthcare, women's rights are human rights is another sign. So this is a friend of mine, Angela Carrington, with her shirt, "Nasty Woman, District 5. She's wearing an Obama hat.
Oh, wow.
So she's a dancer with the Atlanta band, the Marching Abominable Feed and Seed. She is a longtime activist, has been active in progressive left-wing politics since the 60s. So it's good to see Angela there. And these are a couple of other people that I met there that I've stayed friends with. He's holding a sign, "Save Us" or "US, Stop Trump."
And her sign says "Dump Trump." And who were they that you met?
Let's see, did I mark his name? It's Ray D'Africo.
Okay.
And Ray, I believe he had just gotten energized to get involved in actions and start organizing himself right after the election. So he's been very active, very vocal, and has been in the news a lot since then. But I believe it was the election of Trump that got him really motivated to get out. So he's been doing quite a bit of organizing over the past year.
How did you come to meet him at the march?
I think maybe I saw him at a couple of marches and started talking, and he's a longtime Atlanta resident. He's been in a lot of popular bands around town.
Okay.
So we just started comparing notes. And this is Anya Martin, who's a longtime friend of his. So Anya's father was Dr. Bill Martin, who was sociology professor at Georgia State.
Oh, okay.
He was one of my favorite professors, introduced me to Marx.
Oh, interesting.
So then I crossed paths with her again. So after 25 years, I hadn't seen her. I just happened to see her there and met Ray. So people like that I had not seen in the streets before, but I had a lot of other connections with were out there. But there are a lot of other people that I would see on a regular basis. Tim Franson, who was a longtime Atlanta organizer who worked during the Occupy movement.
How would you compare the sort of the more experienced, long-time activists you saw there with the newer, less experienced ones?
Let's see. So if we say activists, we can mean participants as well.
Participants as well, right. I mean, the people, maybe let me rephrase that question, make it a little more clear. So how would you compare the participants, the ones who have more experience going to marches and more experience with activism, to the ones who are more recently energized and were attending maybe their first march or one of their first marches?
Yes. So the people who have been at this for a long time, who have been like consistently active for years, had more of a realization that this is going to take a long time. This is just one event, that this is a significant event, but it's hardly a drop in the bucket of what needs to be done. So they were expressing that when they would speak. And also with street actions, they were able to serve as marshals and help guide people safely through the streets. And
like how would they do that?
we're looking at a picture now of people in yellow vests at the end of the rally at the Capitol. A lot of these people were organizers that I knew who would normally often be speakers. They would run and just kind of help guide the crowd through the streets. Often at rallies, there'll be people running around with boxes of water bottles, distributing water, making sure everybody's okay, making sure that during a march, nobody gets lost, make sure that everybody stays together, nobody starts wandering down an alleyway or street inappropriately without realizing that they've separated from the main group. They help keep the crowds moving so there's not one part of the march that just stops, and to me it would mean everyone behind them would have to stop. They help keep the crowd flowing. If there are musicians, such as in this march, there would be helpers wandering around the musicians, helping give space to them so the crowd doesn't get too much. At the front of marches, I'm looking for a picture here of the front of the march. Here's a couple, but at this one there were so many big names. I'm looking at John Lewis, Shirley Franklin, Hank Johnson. They're on the front line of this march. The volunteers kind of stood in front and made a barrier so that people couldn't kind of break the front line, because it was important for them to stay together to set the pace.
Okay.
So this photo we're looking at shows people kind of in front of them. So that's kind of some of the role of some of the people who've been there before. The people who were new seem to be more elated. I can be a little critical at this point, realizing that this is the first time that they've been out there, but I see much need for growth. It seemed to be a bit more of a self-congratulatory atmosphere, like we did this, we marched today. They were very happy and pleased with themselves. I'm thinking probably the next morning they realized that this was just the beginning of something. We need to be consistent, and if we didn't vote, we need to vote. We need to help get people organized to vote. But during the event that day, I think there was a great sense of elation, and maybe later there became I'm hoping a greater awareness of what needed to be done, that this was just a symbolic first start. I can say that it was, from my personal, very subjective observation, I did notice some interesting things, having been an observer at a lot of Black Lives Matter marches that are predominantly led by Black activist leaders. This march had a lot of white women who were participating in an action for the first time. So it's very funny to contrast a Black Lives Matter march with this march and seeing all of these women when they see police officers running up doing selfies and high-fiving them and hugging police officers saying thank you for your service for keeping us safe.
Well, that's different than...
It's very different in a Black Lives Matter march, or if the marchers are not predominantly white. The police are sometimes a little more aggressive.
Like in what way?
My immediate, my personal reaction to seeing a lot of these women who were white high-fiving and hugging police, not realizing that the Black mothers who are there marching with them have had to have this talk with their teenage sons about what to do. If a police stops you, you have to behave a certain way. And these white women are probably not aware of this talk and this dynamic that their Black comrades have to deal with on a daily basis, and this fear that they might have. So I'm aware in the progressive community that there was some criticism of this march and this movement of being something that they felt left out the needs of Black women. I know that there's an overall criticism of the feminist movement in America of being benefiting mostly white women, and that a lot
of
Black
intersectionality
women,
issue.
Exactly. Black women feel that they are not, their interests are not represented by a lot of recognized and vocal feminist leaders. So I could see in a very microcosm that I can see this dynamic being played out in front of me right here. So that was very interesting. But I think that these people who I'm going to stereotype them, saying they're coming from the suburbs for the first time, they've been energized to get active in a social political movement. They're becoming aware of these issues. This intersectionality is a new word to a lot of people, just not realizing that I'm going to come to this rally because I'm angry that Donald Trump talked about grabbing a pussy. But when you get there, you see that there's a lot of Muslim people who are afraid as well. What's that all about? What's your experience like, here in Atlanta, or meeting people who are representing the LGBTQ population in Atlanta, speaking out around issues. These people from the suburbs coming in, the person next to him is marching with a sign for a different issue. They're going to have these conversations. Wow, I'm glad to meet you and learn about this. And at the end, there were people talking about, universal health care and a lot of other really significant issues. So I think I personally feel far more optimistic seeing these new people come in who have not been aware of everything, of the intersectionality of all of these issues. I'll come back to the march, but since then I have seen in a lot of community meetings that they have been overflowing. Spaces will fill up, and a lot of them are new people who this was their first time to march, was at the Women's March, and they've just gotten involved. Stayed involved.
Would you say the Women's March has maybe brought more people into the fold? Or?
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, let me.
And I haven't talked about the march itself.
Well, that's fine. I mean, this is all very interesting. We've talked about things that are related to the march, but you talked a little bit about um, people taking selfies with law enforcement and high fiving. So first off, what was your own interaction with law enforcement?
On this day,
Mm-hmm.
um, I had none. I took a few pictures of them,
Okay.
as I do.
And how were they about that?
Oh, they were cool about it. They were much more. They were not tense as they had been at other events I've been to.
Okay.
They were much friendlier.
Were black marchers interacting differently with law enforcement than white marchers, or which would you?
I didn't notice any interaction with black marchers.
Okay. So no high fives, no selfies, no just.
I watched. I did not see that. That may have happened. That could very well have happened. However, that was not what I observed.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I mean, you're talking. There's a different dynamic there.
Yeah.
So.
But me as a white guy, I realize there's a lot of things happening that I'm just beginning to be aware of, perhaps, just spending a few years out on the street, observing this. But still, I'm still a white guy, so the cops approach me as a white guy, and I'm usually
Right.
wearing a press pass. So I have a photo ID, and they do look at it, they do check it, because I often will squeeze past police lines at events. And this one I may have pushed past them to get some shots, and they allowed me to.
Okay. Well, how about opposition protesters? Did you see any counter protesters?
I did not see any.
Really?
No.
Hmm.
It's possible that they were there. It's possible there were many counter protesters there, but this crowd was overwhelming with 60,000 people when not that many were anticipated. It was just the crowd was very dense where I was. So it would have been very easy to overlook opposition protesters, and it was very loud. So even if the opposition was shouting, I wouldn't have heard them.
Well, how about what did you think of coverage of the march in the media?
It was there. I don't. I'm glad that it was published. Like locally, Creative Loafing published a lot of my pictures, and had a small summary. I don't know, like personally, my pictures were picked up by other outlets, but I know that these marches did get national coverage, which I'm very glad of. But I'm not plugged in with like mainstream media.
Okay.
So I'm largely unaware of how other people covered it.
Well, were there any specific moments that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I'm looking around back through my pictures. Let's see, the first moment that really stood out to me was being there near the stage at the very beginning and being unaware of the crowd size until we heard it. So that was astonishing itself. And then after the rally there had stopped and people were getting ready to march, just squeezing through the crowd, getting from the media platform through the crowd, just a very short distance to get to the street, and then squeezing through the street to the beginning of the march. took a long time, and that was a great experience, seeing that there were so many people there, so densely packed on a rainy day was very encouraging. And I knew it would make for great pictures, so I was very happy about that. I knew that it would be for dramatic pictures. So squeezing through the crowd was another great moment, just seeing how, had this been a sporting event, people might have been angry and there would have been fights because it was uncomfortable. But there was none of that. Everyone was very glad to be. I'm even projecting onto people, but everyone there seemed to be very glad to be there at that moment because they knew they were participating in something that was historically significant. They knew this is a moment. Squeezing through the crowd was a significant moment, and then when the march started, there's a local Atlanta character, Baton Bob, who led the march. So seeing him come out representing a lot of different communities, seeing him, representing a lot of issues that were contained in the crowd, but him as an Atlanta figure as well was important to me.
Who is Baton Bob exactly?
Baton Bob is a man who, I believe it was after 9/11, decided that his mission to Atlanta was to bring a little bit of mirth, a little bit of happiness. So he would dress up in a majorette uniform and get a whistle and a baton and march through the streets of Atlanta. And he's been doing that since, I believe, 2001. And people just know when they hear that whistle around Midtown or Buckhead that that's Baton Bob marching around. So people come up and take pictures with him and wave to him, and sometimes a little crowd will gather on the sidewalk when they hear him coming and watch him come by. So he's a very visible figure in Atlanta, and people, especially around Midtown and Buckhead, know him.
Okay.
So having him there dressed as kind of a majorette kind of thing.
Yeah, he's got this
little bustier and feathered mask and long red gloves and a baton and a whistle in his mouth. So I know Dr. King gave a speech about needing to be drum majors.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know if that was intentionally tied in, but to me it was symbolic having someone like Baton Bob lead the march. It was great. However, I don't know if 99% of the people who were there knew Baton Bob was leading the march.
Really? Yeah, I have no idea.
Because he was way out front and people couldn't see.
Well, I attended the march, and I had no idea who Baton Bob was until I started on the oral history project for it. So, it's...
And following Baton Bob was refugees.
Wow.
Young people representing different refugee communities had their arms locked in a line before the banners and before the dignitaries. So they were representing this issue around refugees, because at the time, we were talking about, will we let in more refugees into the U.S., and people were in the news were really talking about, they're calling it a refugee crisis in Europe. So having all of these young people there, representing different nationalities, different ethnicities, and wearing T-shirts that says, all of their T-shirts in the front line say, "Refugees Welcome, USA."
Oh,
wow. So they formed a line, but I have a feeling 99% of the people there didn't know what was happening. Had Baton Bob representing a certain community, these people representing a certain community. And then behind them, at the very beginning of the march, you had civil rights leader John Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking around for pictures. Hank Johnson, who's representative, was involved in the civil rights movement, and next between them is Shirley Franklin, the former Atlanta mayor. And standing in front of them is Francis Johnson, who was president of the Georgia NAACP. He's a longtime activist. So they're up front, and they're I'll introduce you, or I'll give you some names of some other people you might want to contact for other interviews. Like, she's a first-time organizer here, and Gina, who's in this picture here, is a first-time organizer.
Is that Gina Guru?
Yes, that's her.
Okay, yeah. Susan talked to me about her.
Yeah, she would be good to interview. I believe Stacey Abrams is up here as well, State Representative Stacey Abrams.
Is that's more Arrested Development?
Yes.
So you said there were musicians marching in the crowd?
Yes, I did not hear any of them.
Okay.
But I believe it was pretty sure it was maybe members of the Wasted Potential Brass Band, the Black Sheep Ensemble.
Who are those groups?
They're mostly brass bands that play around Atlanta. They can march while they play. So they would play a lot of kind of New Orleans flavored band music, and a lot of their own kind of interpretations of rock and roll songs and original compositions that are a lot of fun. It's not a traditional like high school marching band,
right.
But these are brass bands that play in a lot of events around Atlanta, and a lot of them are a part of a coalition of more activist bands. So they'll get together and help support things. So like at the March for Science that happened later, there was a lot of them there. I think there may have been individual musicians as well. I'm remembering now a young man with a trombone by himself walking around playing, and the crowd really always responds to music. There's a lot of chanting that was going on. I don't know if there was chanting when you were there, but in a crowd this size, it's difficult for people to follow the same chants that are being led, say at the front. You can only hear it so far back, so things can get out of sync. So there were a lot of different chants going on throughout the
Do you remember
march.
any of them? Or?
Stop Trump was No Justice, No Peace, things like that were very common ones. Pussy Grabs Back was a new one that had just started recently. So the march was overall, and there's Moms for Gun Sense. So there were people representing that organization. The march was fairly short. This went from the Center for Civil and Human Rights to Liberty Plaza, which is behind the Capitol. So the whole march may have lasted perhaps an hour and a half.
Okay. How far a distance is that? Do you know?
Can't remember. I don't know if it's a mile and a half.
So where did you start at the march?
I started, the start of the march ended up rallying very near where the CNN Center is, on the corner of Olympic Park Boulevard and Marietta Street. So they were coming up Olympic Park in front of where the Ferris wheel is, toward Marietta Street. Because it took a long time to get everything set up at the beginning of the march, so I ran up and started at the beginning. So I was photographing Baton Bob and this line of people, the young people representing different refugees from different nations. And then I was photographing as best I could of the civil rights leaders. And a lot of people I knew were around the front of the march, including Susan, with their signs. So I started there, and then I shot some around the intersection there at Marietta Street, trying to get the CNN logo and some of the pictures. And then I just kind of will just stop in the middle of a crowd and let people wash past me. So I'm taking pictures as people are streaming around me. Then I'll go and shoot from I ran down Marietta Street a little ways toward the area where the Capitol is and shot some of that as people were passing me. So I kind of snaked around that area.
Okay.
And I just kind of stayed, kind of toward the front, but around in the crowd. Not my president. I'm looking at a sign,
right.
The picture I'm looking at now, and not my president was a major chant.
So was there any moments for you that were particularly emotional, or that?
I can't think of specific moments. I'm looking at pictures and remembering some things. Although I'm there mostly as thinking of things visually.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a young woman who is at the end in front of the Capitol. So I took a picture of this young woman holding a sign saying, I am a survivor of sexual violence. Donald Trump is a rapist. And then it says allegations and has a lot of small text, which I guess has the names of the accusers. So she's holding that sign in front of the Capitol, which was very symbolic for me. And that was a significant moment. I felt strongly about that, about her statement, identifying herself as a victim. And I believe I have a picture here. Two women kissing as they march.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is holding a sign that says Islamophobic violence is nurtured by histories of anti-Black racist violence. And it's a quote from Angela Davis.
Oh, wow.
So there's a sign behind them with a woman that says freedom equals choice. So I'm thinking they may be a part of the organization Southerners on New Ground, or SONG. So seeing two women kiss at an anti-Trump march was a significant moment. So I guess that there were a lot of things that struck me as being an emotional moment. Seeing a view like that, I believe it's on Ivan Allen. So I'm looking at a picture now of the crowd from a distance, and just the picture has many thousands of people with a lot of different signs. There's an old silence equals death banner back there.
Oh, wow,
with
yeah.
The pink triangle.
I remember that
which
from the
I believe
80s.
is Queer Nation, who was very active AIDS activists. Yeah, from the 80s. So seeing that banner along with all the others was an emotional moment for me. And this, I can see, 100, 200, 100 and 200 signs. And in this picture we're looking at, we can see a sign that has a drawing of the Statue of Liberty with her face in her hands. And a sign that says, God hates Trump. The future is female. I march for her, referring to Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
So a site like that, to me, seeing so many issues represented in a single image is to me, a powerful moment.
Yeah. So how did you feel? So you just took a lift back from the march. How did you wrap up the day?
Well, the march went down by the Capitol building, past it to an area that's called Liberty Plaza. So in the past, protests and rallies used to happen at the front door of the Capitol. They used to get there was a large wide walkway plaza area right there in front of the Capitol where everyone used to gather, protests and marches. But I believe it was 2 years ago, maybe a year ago, the city said that you can't have protests or rallies right there at the Capitol anymore. You have to go to Liberty Plaza. So they built a plaza area. It's across the street, across Capitol Avenue, where you can go, and it has a fence around it. So it's like a free speech zone, but you have to go on the other side of this fence in order to speak out there. So the crowd went there, and I followed mostly in front of the crowd, and I saw where they were setting up a stage area where speakers are going to gather and address the crowd. So it took, once I got to that stage, it took the crowd maybe another hour or so before the park was filled. The park was, I believe, beyond capacity, and there were people gathering in the streets all around. And I assume by that point, a lot of people just turned away and left because only a small percentage of people could fit there in that plaza. So they once again spoke. There, Senator Vincent Fort spoke. Francis Johnson spoke. Stacey Abrams spoke as well. There were some labor leaders that spoke there as well, and there's Park Cannon, who's a city council person. There's Nan McMurray there who spoke as well at the end. But the crowd gathered there with their signs in that plaza and rallied and cheered and listened to a very strong progressive message, which was encouraging to me to hear. People that I have my idea of what their lives are like outside the perimeter. But they were there listening to what in previous years might sound like radical words and cheering it on.
So quite possibly things that sounded radical a few years ago are becoming maybe more normal now, or?
I think so. I know with Bernie Sanders having been in the running for president, kind of made the word socialist a little bit more acceptable, and things like the idea of universal health care and education for all don't sound like radical, crazy ideas to more mainstream people now.
Well, how did you feel the day after the march?
I was still processing it. Whenever I'm at a large demonstration like that, it takes me a while to process it because I'm excuse me, I'm not really a participant in what's happening around me. So and I'm mostly looking for visuals and trying to capture what's happening because I want to make the viewer of the images that I make feel like they're there, so they get some idea of, this is the crowd size, this was what they were feeling and doing. But I'm just trying to represent that visually. So afterwards, I usually sit and review everything in my head. Which I did the day after this march, and I felt more optimistic. I felt a sense of elation that so many people came in the rain and there were so many new people out there. So I had hoped that people would just see this as a beginning and would just kind of stay involved. And having seen John Lewis speak, I think a lot of people were more energized.
Okay. How long do you feel that, it took you to process it?
Oh, I think until today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about it because the next parade, or then on January 20th, there's an event called Power to the Polls.
Right.
Which is organized by the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice, which is the same organizers. I'm going to run to the bathroom.
Sure, let me pause real quick.
Pick back up with my reaction.
Yeah. So let's see. What were we talking about before we paused?
Kind of my reaction to the next day. So I am still processing, thinking about the significance of that day and the new people and all of the actions that have happened since. But there are some things, like we just had the mayoral election here in Atlanta recently, and there was a low voter turnout, which was disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad to see that this year's, or 2018 March, they're calling it Power to the Polls, which is significant. So they're focusing on getting people registered to vote, maybe running for office, and getting people involved in elections. So I'm glad that they're moving in that direction.
Yeah.
Because I had wondered the day after, part of my reaction was how many of those 60,000 people voted in this, in the presidential election.
Yeah. I don't know. So what about your family, friends, and colleagues? What do they think about your documenting the march and your, aim to sort of amplify the voices of people there?
I don't talk to my family about it. My family's conservative.
I see.
So there's not any real discussion or reaction from them regarding it. A lot of my friends were a part of the march, so I did photograph a lot of my friends holding signs and tagging them on Facebook. I tagged quite a few on Facebook. So the reaction has been positive among people that I know and among the organizers and such, and I feel that I was privileged to be able to document it and, give pictures which have been used by the organizations like the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice that I think may have just been formed for that. I think the organizing committee changed their name to the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice following the march, realizing that they needed to have some longer term structure.
Well, they were originally called, but
let's see. Atlanta March for Social Justice.
I see.
So this is the original Facebook invite. So 16,000 people RSVP'd to the Facebook page for it. So this might be an interesting page for you to look at in your research.
Yeah, it would be.
So we're looking at the Facebook event page for the January 21st, 2017 Atlanta March for Social Justice and Women that was hosted by the organizing group Atlanta March for Social Justice and Women.
Okay.
So they just
So did you,
changed.
have you documented any marches since then, or?
Yes, quite a few. So we had the March for Science, which was another big one. That was after that. And I'm scrolling back through albums
sure.
on Facebook that remind me, because I always post everything up here to document it. So I'm looking at some that happened before. So this is the Electoral College protest. Let's see, and Bernie Sanders came and spoke a few days before the march.
Oh, wow.
And let's see, there was a couple of marches on Inauguration Day. So this was, just a few days before the Women's March.
How about
There was a large
after the march? When was the March for Science?
Let's see. The March for Science, April 22nd. Yeah, April 22nd.
Okay.
And it met over in Candler Park. And that was the next large rally like that. So we've had several marches since then. Let's see, between the, the Women's March was then, and then we had another big event a few days later at the airport.
Oh, yeah.
And that event was called Stand for Refugees and Immigrants, and that was January 29th. So thousands of people showed up at the airport.
Wow.
So I think a lot of these were some of the first timers who were just kind of motivated to go out and do something, say something after that. And then right after that event, there was another big rally, Atlanta Stands with Muslims and Refugees, that happened on February 4th here in Midtown. Again, I saw a lot of new faces there at this rally. And there was a few that happened.
There was a March for Healthcare, I think, at the end of February.
Yes. And so many marches.
Wow. So how do you feel that the Women's March has had an effect on these subsequent marches, or?
Yes. Yeah.
How would you describe that?
It's gotten new people out there, maybe with fresh ideas, people who are not tired of being in the trenches and organizing and calling people to get them to register to vote and write postcards, call their representatives. So it's been motivating new people to do a lot of this kind of thing. So let's see. You were looking at Facebook,
right?
It won't always show the date of them.
Okay.
On this little preview we have here. But there's March for Healthcare here, which was in February. That's February 25th.
Okay.
The March for Healthcare happened. And a lot of people came and marched, all the same faces. There's another on March the 11th, another protest regarding the immigrant ban. See, there's a march against gentrification in Atlanta with some of the same people were there. April 1st. So there's Dawn. Senator Fort would have been here, and he was one of the speakers at.
Well, did the Women's March affect in any way how you document subsequent marches, or how you? I mean, did it have a personal impact on you?
I'm sure it had a personal impact, but I don't know if it changes the way I do document, other than there's um, a lot more people that I know now in the streets. So I'm often taking more pictures of people that I know at these things.
How would you describe its personal impact?
Describe the
Impact of the
impact, but not necessarily on my work.
on you personally.
I do feel more optimistic about our ability to respond to everything involved in Trump's election. And I feel that I feel good about my decision to help amplify the voices of organizers. But I think I'm still doing it maybe about the same way. I mean, my technical skills are improving, but personally, I feel more optimistic.
Okay. So you feel your role really is to document and to. Could you? I never really asked you to elaborate on what you meant by amplify. Actually, I thought maybe that'd be a good idea.
Since I'm taking, say, like at the, let's see, I'm looking at my photos from the, I don't know, the tax march here that happened in March.
Oh, right.
So I've got, I don't know, maybe 100 pictures or so of this that I've supplied to news agencies. So the wire services have them, so people around the world can pick up the pictures and see that, you know, this many people marched insisting on Donald Trump to release his tax records. This many people marched in Atlanta for this. So it helps word get out that way. And since I'm taking these pictures and giving so many to the organizing groups, they can use them for their own promotional needs. So that's kind of what I mean by amplifying. I'm just giving them this, so they're not having to hire a photographer to document it.
Okay. Well, what do you hope will happen?
Hope will happen because of the Women's March.
Or just, I mean, what are your hopes for the future about the Trump administration?
My hope is that the pendulum is swinging back in the other direction. I think that perhaps a lot of damage has been done already that may take generations to get over. But my hope is that the pendulum will swing back to the left and people will realize that the stakes are pretty high right now. I don't know how realistic that is, but I think the pendulum is going to need a lot of help to swing back. It's not going to swing back without us responding and raising our voices.
And what do you think the Women's March, what role do you think the Women's March would have in that?
It was a significant, visible act that made a very strong statement that the people are not satisfied with Trump, that they are going to stand in firm opposition to a lot of things that he stands for. So I think it gave the people there who attended all the marches around the country a greater sense of optimism and direction. And a lot of people have been very active since then. So that's my hope of what will come out of it, is that that momentum will be maintained.
Okay. I'm just looking at the last of our questions. How have you felt about the Trump administration since the march?
I'm dismayed.
Okay.
Every day I'm dismayed. I think I'm not shocked as much at things that are done, but I am dismayed and feel a need to just continuously stand in opposition to it. I feel more motivated to be vocal about things I care about. But I'm dismayed.
Well, I think, is there anything else you would like to add? I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
I think it will be interesting to see what happens at the March in January of 2018, to see what people have done with their year, because there'll be so many people coming back together, and I assume that the speakers will be talking about their activities over the past year.
That's cool. All right. Well, I appreciate you taking your time. And we're done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.